Thank you. Welcome. Welcome to Fireside Friday. I am Chris. I am your host for the day. And today we are going to be talking about evaluating risk. I've got a copy of the slides in the Fire/content channel. So that's the channel that's one below where we're actually doing live chat. Well, yep, see the gong is going off, so that means it's time to start. Cool. Oh, we've just got it all over the place today. Thanks to our sponsors. Thanks to Herman and Emily for helping out with getting all this content together. And I mentioned a little bit earlier, today's just going to be lecture. We'll do a little bit of stuff as far as like working through risk together, but no need for like configuring a laptop or anything like that. So if you're a security person, you're kind of assumed to know this stuff already, right? Eric was asking, where's Keith? Keith is actually on PTO today. So he is with us in spirit, but not in video. So yeah, as a security person, you're kind of expected to be able to understand risk and how it works and how to evaluate it and all that other fun stuff, which is not necessarily the case. We tend to kind of wing this, right? Like if someone says, oh, well, what's the likelihood of X or how much do I have to worry about Y getting compromised? For the most part, we tend to just kind of ballpark guess without a whole lot to go on. But there are actually some established methodologies we can go through and use to try and maybe not get an exact bullseye, but maybe be a little bit closer to the target on the whole thing. As far as like you know, dealing with risk, a lot of this is going to come back to the systemic approaches we talked about last week, where we want to look at, what are the different layers that we want to go through and protect. We want want to accept a framework that, describes those layers and we can see what we want to go after with each. So I showed one that used like the MITRE ATT&CK matrix last week. I showed one that used the OSI model. You can go with something like SOC 2. I mean, there's a bunch of different options out there you can go through and choose from. But the idea is to go through and plan your architecture as opposed to expand your architecture, based on what you read on Discord one particular week. So what is risk? Risk is a combination of three things. First is an asset. This is something that has value to an organization. So this could be a physical item, it could be intellectual property, it could be data. It's something that has some level of value that, the organization leverages to make a profit or whatever their business model happens to be. The other is a vulnerability against that asset. So this could be, hey, our servers are our asset, but we store them on the front sidewalk. Well, there's our point of vulnerability. They're kind of open to anybody to grab them. Or, this could be, and typically is software based. And then a threat, which is somebody who would be willing to go through and exploit that. There are folks that live in communities where no one locks their doors. That could be considered a vulnerability, but they're, these rural areas that tends to be no threat actors. So the risk is relatively low because there isn't anybody who's actually trying to take advantage of those vulnerabilities. And I always kind of like to look at this as like a game of Clue, right? The whole thing with the game of Clue was to go through and kind of figure out, who performed the murder and where and how did they do it, right? Well, risk assessment is kind of the same thing, and I gave you some examples here. Instead of Colonel Mustard in the library with a candlestick, it could be an untrained employee in production using poor procedures. It's the same type of thing. So if you kind of, for me, it's always kind of helped for me for whatever reason to kind of refer back to Clue to be able to think about, what are the different components here. That's a good way to go through and describe it. So what are assets? As I said, this is anything that has value towards the organization. It's usually something that helps support whatever the business model happens to be. And, assets are obviously going to have different levels of value to them. If we're storing customer private information, obviously that's going to have a certain value to it. The wastebasket under my desk, so I don't have to walk outside to the dumpster every time I want to walk away. that has a value to it as an asset. It's saving me time every day. So there's a lot of assets that we end up having to deal with, and sometimes that can get a little bit overwhelming. We'll talk about some methods to try and kind of sift through what you really need to worry about and what you don't, at least from a cybersecurity perspective. And these can be tricky to value, right? Like I've noticed that when people tend to look at the value of an asset, they look at the direct value that asset contributes to the organization, and they don't necessarily stop and think about, are there any other possibilities here? And I'll give you a great example, a network printer, right? So we got a printer that's hooked up to the network that people can print to. And you may look at that and say, well, that's a real fairly low value asset, right? It's a printer. We got three of them. If we lose one, we still got two. It's not a big deal, and we don't print that often anyway. So, if an attacker was to take that printer offline, that really wouldn't be that big of a deal. That's not going to be a lot of a business loss. Well, okay, but what if they use it as a foothold? What if that's the conduit to get in and get access to everything else in your environment? So from the attacker's perspective, that asset could have a lot of value to them as far as moving forward their attack against your environment. So that's something that we need to kind of tweak into this as well. So when we're looking at the value of an asset, a majority of this is what's its value to us. But it behooves you to kind of pause and think about, okay, are there other possibilities off of this? Like, does this have value to the attacker themselves? In which case, maybe we need to consider this asset to be a higher value than it normally would be. So, what are our threats? In other words, we talked about, so we've got assets, they have a value to them. Who may want to exploit a vulnerability against them, either knowingly or unknowingly? We've got a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of talk about, insider threat. And you'll hear a lot of folks say, "Oh, insider threat is the biggest threat that's out there." And that kind of tweaked me, right? Just from like are people inherently good or evil perspective, because what that implied to me was that there are more bad people than good people, and that's why we have this insider threat problem. And the reality is, when you go through and pick through the data, a majority of the insider threats are human error. It's people making mistakes. And it's not necessarily that human's fault. We talked last week about the importance of doing blameless postmortems. It's easy for me to say, oh, Bill screwed up. Bill messed this up. We'll spank Bill and tell him not to mess up again. And now we've got a corrective action to move forward and we're fine. But the reality is, no. If Bill messed up, more than now, it could be Bill's gone rogue, but that isn't the case most of the time with most of the instances where this stuff occurs. Usually what it is it's either it's the procedure is poorly documented, or it's not documented at all, so it's easy to introduce mistakes, or there's no audit process to go in and check that, right? Like if my process says, oh, you need to manually go in and change these configuration files. Well, if I know a human's making those changes, shame on me if I don't have an audit process behind that, right? Because humans make mistakes. Sometimes, we meant to hit the letter E and we hit the letter R instead, and now there's a typo and something will fail. So do we have a process in place in order to be able to fix that? We've seen situations where you know, an error will get pushed out into production to multiple systems at the same time. And usually it's because there's no decent QA process in place to test those changes to make sure they're not going to cause everything to break. That's a process issue. So part of it, part of one of the best ways to deal with insider is to look at this from a process perspective. But the other is also, damn it, run a decent culture. These cultures where you feel like everybody has to be in it for themselves because everybody else might stab them in the back. And, accounting may decide that it'd be more profitable to, lay off X number of employees this week because that might actually increase stock by Y amount or, some BS like that. If you're operating like that, don't be surprised when no one gives a crap. Don't be surprised when someone might look at something and say, hey, that doesn't look quite right, or hey, it would be pretty easy to improve on that. But F it, it's not my job. I don't care. And if you've got a poor culture, people are going to feel that way. They also may feel like, yeah, I could fix that, but that might get me attention. And a lot of times when people get attention, they get laid off. So I'm going to try and hide in the background so no one pays attention to me so I don't have to worry about my job. So, again, good culture goes a long way towards dealing with insider issues. Could possibly be competitors, organized crime, generic jerks. They do it just because they can. Yeah, some people are like that. There are folks that kind of feel like, yeah, it's okay for me to break into your environment because I didn't have malicious intent. I wasn't breaking in because I wanted to steal your data. I broke in just because I wanted to see if I could do it. Well, gee, thanks. That still screws up my day, week, month, whatever it takes to be able to recover after that type of an issue. Non-hostile threats, like I said, accidental, inadvertent, changes to things, a typo, those happen. Blameless postmortem is the way to go through and kind of deal with that. Structural problems, so things like just not having good processes in place to be able to deal with things. How do we go through and prioritize what vulnerabilities get fixed first? First of all, how do we figure out if we're vulnerable to things? We need a process for that. Now, once we figure out what we're vulnerable to, how do we prioritize those to make sure they're getting addressed accordingly to reduce the amount of risk against us as quickly as possible? So those would be structural in nature. The environmental ones are there, but they don't really apply to us because they're not necessarily cyber related. And there are different types of risks. So, again, some of these kind of cross multiple categories like the human mistakes. One we haven't talked about yet is strategic risk. This doesn't apply to us in cyber that frequently, but it is good to kind of be aware of them just so you're being a little bit more holistic within the environment itself. In other words, ability to execute a specified time. What do I mean by that? Well, markets tend to kind of ebb and flow, right? Like the iPhone, when that came out, it hit the market exactly when people were ready for that type of a product. If the iPhone was delayed 3, 4 years, I can guarantee Apple wouldn't have the market share they do today. So being able to execute when needed is a strategic risk because maybe you're not going to be able to go through and do that. So like I said, these don't necessarily directly apply to security, but every organization deals with them. It's good to kind of be aware of what's within the organization and prioritize it accordingly. In other words, if you see a risk to the business, let's say if there's a potential failure of being able to implement the business plan and actually make a profit, even though it's not cyber related, as someone who works for that company or that organization that will be out of a job if it goes out of business, it kind of behooves you to get involved to say, hey, how can I help? We have this problem. It's a bigger risk against the organization than any of the cyber stuff I'm dealing with right now. I'm happy to jump in and lend a hand if I can. I've been involved with that type of thing more than once. Um, Compliance risks. This is so I've got here fines, penalties due to lack of compliance. Really, where I see it uh, have the biggest financial hit is the inability to break into certain market segments, right? Like if you want to do business with like an Amazon, let's say, they're going to want to make sure that you have your SOC 2, your ISO 27000. There's certain security frameworks they're going to want to make sure that you're following. And if you don't have those in place, they may not be willing to do business with you because you would pose a risk to their environment because you don't have enough security controls in place. So the compliance risk for me, the fines, the penalties, yeah, those are all well and good, but the actual inability to execute on what you're trying to accomplish, that's the one that can really cost an organization an awful lot of money. Okay, so we've got an asset that is vulnerable and some form of threat actor that could potentially take advantage of that vulnerability to compromise our asset. What can we do to try and deal with the risk that gets created by that situation? Well, we've got four possibilities. And typically we'll end up going with a combination. Usually accept is part of that combination. In other words, we might try to avoid or mitigate, but we're not going to be able to avoid or mitigate 100%. So there may be some percentage that we end up just saying, okay, that's good enough. And we'll talk in a little bit about, okay, so how do we figure out when enough is good enough? So one of the things we could try and do is risk avoidance. This the how successful this can be really depends upon like what's the risk and how are you trying to avoid it, right? Like we can say, oh, hey, I'm worried about the Windows vulnerabilities, so I'm going to avoid all those Windows vulnerabilities by running a Linux system instead. Well, but Linux has vulnerabilities against it too. So yeah, you're probably safe from all those Windows vulnerabilities now, but that doesn't mean there aren't other vulnerabilities that you're going to have to take on instead. And does it make sense to make that kind of change? That's a decision that needs to get made within the organization itself. So you get the idea. Sometimes avoidance just simply shifts what it is we need to be concerned about. Mitigation is what we typically tend to do. So with mitigation, I say, okay, there's a risk, and I'm going to try and reduce that risk as much as I possibly can. So for example, I have a web server. It has remote access via SSH, and it's got TCP/80 and TCP/443 open so that people can come in and access our web pages. And I may say, okay, well, only administrators need access to SSH. So I'm going to put some firewall rules in place so that only the organization's assigned IP address space can actually access that SSH port. And now that'll dramatically reduce all the potential SSH risks because you've got to be on that internal environment in order to be able to get to that port in the first place. And for the web stuff, I might decide, okay, I'm going to run a reverse proxy in front of it. And that may help me go through and clean up a lot of the vulnerabilities that are associated with, the web traffic as well. But it isn't going to get rid of everything. And with limiting SSH access to the internal network, well, but what if there's a VPN, right? What if someone can like password spray a VPN that gets them access to the internal network? Now they could turn around and from there go to port 22 on the web server. So by implementing some firewall rules, implementing a reverse proxy, we've probably eliminated 90% of the risks that are involved there, but there's still going to be some level left over after that. So now we have to ask ourselves, how much are we going to worry about that? So for example, we could say, well, we're going to create a policy that says, you must use public-private key and you need to use all three factors of authentication. Actually, not just public-private keys, you need to use all three factors of authentication. So the public-private key just, gets you minimally into the server, and then from there you need a YubiKey, and, after that it does a scan of your eardrum to make sure it's actually you, or, whatever the case may be. We're going to add in all these additional layers of authentication to help protect SSH. Well, you could, but is it worth it, right? Like if we've eliminated 90% of the risk, is it worth spending that much time and effort to go after that last 10%? Probably not. So we may end up in a situation where we say, okay, we're just going to go through and accept what's left over. We've mitigated the big stuff. We'll deal with the other stuff through system logging or whatever the case may be. Risk transfer. So this is one that you're going to get different answers from different people, right? Like with PCI, PCI clearly states that, hey, you can outsource processing your credit cards to a third party, but that doesn't exempt you from the responsibility of those remaining in a secure state. Well, yes and no, right? Like you can say that, and it sounds good. And I get where you're going. You want to make sure people don't feel like they have no responsibility at all anymore. So I get why you're saying that. But the reality is that isn't how it works out, right? So imagine like I use, I don't know, Stripe to process credit cards, and Stripe gets compromised. Technically, per the letter of the law, any of my customers' credit cards that got accessed, I'm kind of responsible for as well. But in reality, is that actually true? Right? Like, what's my get out of jail free card? My get out of jail free card is, hey, Stripe is an authorized credit card processing company. They're listed on the PCI website. They have their attestations in place. You know, there was nothing that I could have looked at that would have hinted to me that they may have been, open to compromise. So I did the best job I could. So rather than me being in front of all the people with the pitchforks and torches who were pissed off about the credit cards getting stolen, I actually get to kind of sneak into that group of people, grab my own pitchfork or torch, and say, "Ooh, Stripe, you were evil," and there's probably going to be no fallout from that. So while some folks will read contracts and say you can't transfer risk, the reality of it is, and we've seen this over and over again in the wild, yeah, you can. Because if that entity gets whacked, it isn't just going to be the credit cards you gave them that gets compromised. It's going to be a bunch of others. So people are going to go after them. They're not going to go after you. So you can actually transfer risk. And there can be an awful lot of benefits to that. We'll get into this later when we talk about different security frameworks. But like, one of the things that kind of comes out of this very quickly is that if I've given my credit card processing to Stripe, I have far fewer controls to deal with. PCI DSS has, I think they're up to like 350 controls now. But if I go through and I use iframes to have Stripe do the credit card processing for me, the number of controls I'm responsible for drops down to like 12. There's not much responsibility I have anymore because they're dealing with all of that. So yeah, you can actually transfer risk. And then there's acceptance. And acceptance of risk is okay when it's an informed decision. The problem is most of the time it's acceptance of risk out of ignorance, meaning we don't know any better. I think I mentioned earlier there was an environment I was working with that did quarterly vulnerability tests. They did quarterly simulated incident responses where, a security event would occur and they would, go through and practice responding to that, which is great, except everyone they had done for like the couple of years before I saw it was was they had done DDoS simulations because that's what they knew. They didn't do anything where, hey, so, this web server that's hanging its butt out there gets compromised and it's got customer information on it. How are we going to respond to that? They didn't bother with any of that. So they were knowledgeably accepting the level of risk associated with DDoS attacks because they understood that model and how it worked and what they could do. But the actual getting a system broken into and getting data stolen, that was an acceptance through ignorance because they really weren't dealing with that and didn't really know how to deal with that. Let's see, Chris, under PCI, if you outsource, responsibility is still with the outsourcer to ensure the vendor is following the PCI standard. Yeah, I completely agree with that statement. And as I said, I stated per the letter of the law, you are still responsible. But the reality is, if their PCI documentation is lined up, right? If they've had a proper auditor come in and look them over the last year and all their paperwork straight, I don't have a whole lot of ability beyond saying, oh, check mark, you've got your paperwork in place to know how vulnerable to attack they are. And if they are attacked, like I said, they're not just going to get the data that's associated with my account with them. They're probably going to get multiple accounts. So people are going to be pointing the pitchforks that way. So yeah, I totally agree. That's what the PCI documents say. But the reality is it doesn't work that way. It's kind of the same way that like if you get your attestation, you know, you're safe, and it's not. We've had people while a PCI audit has just finished, and the auditor was giving them their blessing. there were miscreants on that network stealing credit card information and had been for a couple of years prior during the prior PCI audits as well. So yeah, there's what's said and there's kind of like the reality that kind of works around that. So when we talk about dealing with risk, right, we're going to try and mitigate it. We've got a couple of ways we can go through and try and do that. One is through, administrative. And administrative is always kind of my least favorite because what we basically do is an edict, thou shalt not go to, thou shalt not click on suspicious links. We have a policy that says you're not allowed to click on suspicious links. Oh, come on, really? Really? You think that's going to fix it? Oh, well, it's a law now, so no one will ever do that again. No, that isn't the problem. The problem typically, what I don't like about administrative is the problem isn't usually administrative, right? The person isn't saying, ooh, someone's attacking me. I'll bet this malware is going to encrypt my drive and I'll lose all my data. I'm going to click that link. Oh, wait, we got a policy saying I can't do that, so I guess I won't. Yeah, no, that's the situation never goes down that way. So administrative to me is more about making auditors happy, right? Auditors want to see you have policies in place that say these things. That doesn't necessarily mean it's actually helping you mitigate that risk per se. It really comes down to the controls themselves and how you've implemented. Operational, that's one I'm really big on because again, we're humans, we make mistakes. One of the nice things about computers is that when they tend in automation is when they screw things up, they screw it up in mass, right? Like think about so the analogy I like to do is think about how we copied books 1,000 years ago. What happened? You'd have a scribe who would have a book in front of them. They would read what's on the page, and then they'd have a blank book below that, and they would write in that blank book what was written in the other book. Well, what's our possibilities for error there? Well, our possibilities for error there are pretty high, right? Like what could get screwed up? Well, everything. Because it's a human. They could write an A instead of an E. They could spell a word wrong. They could swap a word for something else. They could decide, oh, I don't like that sentence. I'm just going to leave that out. Or they may lose their place and leave something out because of that. So with a human, we kind of need a really strict auditing process. We need to check every little single data point because any of them could possibly go bad. So there's a lot of auditing that needs to take place. When you get into automation, though, right? So think photocopier, right? What happens when a photocopier goes bad? Well, if I'm making, let's say, a bunch of booklets with 10 pages, all of them might be missing page 3, right? Because when the copier screws up, it screws up everything, right? I don't have to worry about it changed an A to an E on page 2. That'll never happen. It's a photocopier. It's an automated process. But it might end up missing a page. It might do a page backwards. It might, have a blank page in there. But it will end up being as part of every kit. That's one of the things I kind of like about automation. Because if let's say I manually deploy 50 servers, I have to manually check 50 servers. If I've deployed 50 servers through Ansible or through, let's say through Chef, all I got to do is go in and check my recipes and spot check one, maybe two systems, bang, I'm done. I don't have to do a granular check of everything because, again, everything's in an automated process. So I personally feel one of the best ways to deal with mitigating risk is doing as much automation as you possibly can. Technical possibilities, this comes down to the software we use and stuff like that. That one's pretty common. Most people are kind of up to speed on that. Now, when we talk about trying to identify how much risk are we dealing with, right? How much risk is actually there that I need to worry about? There's two methods that we tend to fall back on, qualitative and quantitative. And their approaches are slightly different, although you honestly, even quantitative does include a little bit of qualitative processing inside of it. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But let's start with qualitative. This is the first one. And actually, let's talk about how do you remember the difference between them, right? Because there's qualitative and quantitative. What do they mean? Well, we'll get into the deep parts of the definitions in just a second. But for the most part, qualitative comes down to make your best guess. That's really what qualitative comes down to, is make your best guess. Quantitative actually comes down to measuring things and calculating things. So the way I tend to remember this is qualitative requires a quality person to do the process, right? So qualitative, quality. Link those two together. Quality, quality person to do a qualitative audit. Quantitative calculates quantities. So I kind of look at it that way to try and remember which one is which. So qualitative, what is that? Guesstimation in money. Yeah. Yeah, you can look at that that way too. Absolutely. Although I like it to rhyme a little bit. That tends to make it a little bit easier for me to go through and remember. So qualitative is not an exact science. This tends to be um, you use your years, months, days, centuries, whatever it is of experience to go through and make your best guess as to how likely something is to occur. Now, the problem with this is that you can ask 10 people to do a qualitative audit, and you're going to get not only are you going to get 10 different answers, you may get 10 wildly different answers depending upon who it is that you talk to, right? So let's say there's a certain, there's a potential for a vulnerability against a web server. Some folks may look at that and say, oh, well, that's really high. And then someone else would say, well, actually, that's pretty low because the server in question is behind the firewall. When the first person didn't actually think about the fact that, well, you can't get access to the web server from the internet anyway, so that's going to reduce the risk. Again, it comes down to the quality of the person that went through and did that estimation. So it's not just the fact that you'll get 10 different answers, you'll get 10 different, wildly different answers. So qualitative kind of is a last resort, but even with that, it tends to be what we use an awful lot of the time. And, there are lots of charts out there like this one to help you kind of rank what it is that you need to go in and worry about. And it's a matter of looking at impact and probability. Now, we kind of look at those as part of a quantitative process as well. But with quantitative, we actually try and put some dollar values and numbers around them. Here, we're just kind of ballparking it. It's almost like sprint cycles, right? If I have like a feature I want to add, one of the questions I might ask my team is, not how many hours will that take you? Because it's hard to define an exact number of, well, it's going to be exactly, 173 lines of code. Therefore, it will take me 3 hours, 42 minutes, and 10 seconds. Yeah, no, no. We tend to do it based on like t-shirt sizes or something general like that. Oh, this is a small, this is a medium, this is a large. Oh, this is an extra large project. It's going to be within a range type of thing. And I like to look at these kind of that same way. So you're looking at how likely is this to occur and what would the impact be to the organization. That's going to identify the severity level that we're going in and dealing with. So what kind of plays into all of that? Age is one of them. How long has this vulnerability existed for? Is this something that just got introduced with the last minor release? Or is this something that got introduced 8 years ago and we're now catching it now? You know, the probability of it being exploited is going to vary widely between those two, right? Because you can have far more people who's used some version of the software over the last 8 years and still haven't played today versus who might have that one specific version that happens to be vulnerable. Complexity. How hard is it to actually perform this exploit? Sometimes these are dead easy. Point a web browser at it, type this in, bang, you've hosed that system. It might be as easy as that. Some of these are, well, actually, you need to string multiple vulnerabilities together or multiple exploits together in order for this vulnerability to exist. In which case, that makes it far more difficult. If you can automate it in a script, that means anybody can run it. That tends to mean that, the complexity is pretty low. You're far more likely to run into somebody trying to exploit this. Accessibility. How easy is this to go through and do it? I mentioned, oh, well, hey, if it's in a script, well, that's still going to throw some people off because they're not comfortable working within a terminal or command line. But make it into a GUI, and oh, yeah, now everybody can point and click. So that's going to increase the probability of this occurring even more. And is there a fix available? That's a huge one. right? Is, if it's known this vulnerability is there, does the person, does the each organization who's vulnerable actually have something they can install to make that go away, or are they going to be stuck trying to come up with some other means to mitigate that, right? Like SSH is vulnerable. Well, if there's a patch, I can just go through and patch it. If there isn't a patch, well, about the only thing I can do is try and restrict what IPs can actually get to my system. And how easy or hard or possible that is going to be different for each environment. So not every environment might be able to implement those mitigating factors. So that's another one that'll go through and kind of drive, what's the severity level that we're dealing with here. And this is what the CVSS system is for. So the Common Vulnerability Scoring System attempts to go in and give you a numeric value between 0 and 10 to help you identify what is the severity of this. Now, I've seen people argue, so full disclaimer, I was involved with this in the early days when it first started up. So, disclaimer there. So take whatever else I say, with that as a kind of a preface to it. I will say I do feel like these have value. Are they always 100% accurate? No, of course not, right? Like if there's a web server vulnerability, the score that gets assigned is going to be based on that web server being exposed to internet access. Well, if you have a proxy in front of it, that may reduce the severity level of this issue, somewhat. If I'm running it internally only and only my internal users who I can fire if they try and do this have access to that server, well, that's going to reduce this score value even more, the severity level even more. So part of that score, the score has a number of things they kind of work in to figure out, what that number should be. But some of it is, accessibility and the ability for, how many people can actually go through and exploit this. Let's see, is there anything Chris wasn't a part of in the early days? Yeah, there were definitely things I was not a part of. But yeah, I do try to jump in and help out anytime I can. So, and most people are familiar with the CVSS system. Most vulnerability scanners directly refer to this and give you a score number based on this system whenever a vulnerability gets found. So to kind of give you an example of how this works, last year, ConnectWise, it was discovered had a vulnerability. The age of this had existed in every version of their product since version 1. So it had been around for many years and every single version was vulnerable. ConnectWise makes a tool that allows people to manage networks remotely, and they specifically market to managed security providers. So the idea is I'm a managed security provider. I'm going to manage, security or the IT environment or both or whatever for, let's say I specialize in law offices. So I have a bunch of small law offices that I take care of their IT needs and their security needs. And what I might do is drop a ConnectWise box on their network so that I can remote into that ConnectWise box. And then from there, I can jump to any system that I need to. And that gives me remote access to the entire environment and allows me to collect statistics about what's going on. I can do all sorts of cool things with it. But this vulnerability was found that had existed since the tool was first created, that the high-end hackor tool you needed to exploit this vulnerability was a web browser, any web browser. It wasn't like it was just Chrome or just Firefox. Any web browser could be used. Accessibility, well, how easy was it to exploit this? Well, you heard me say this is used by MSPs to remotely manage their customers, which means these boxes tend to be internet accessible. So, and they have a unique string that gets sent back when you connect to this web server. So it's real easy to go into Shodan and say, hey, Shodan, go check these ports for me and look for this value. And if you find it, tell me what that IP address is. And Shodan can quickly go out and find the literally tens of thousands of these that are out there on the internet very quickly, no problem. The complexity, I mentioned it was a web browser. What did I have to do with the web browser? I had to go to a specific URL that is normally only used when the box is first brought online. When you first boot this box up, right, the first thing you're supposed to do is connect to it with a web browser. And it says, oh, hey, I'm a brand new server. create an administrator password. And you create an administrator password, and then it forces you to log in with that administrator password, and then you go in and you start going through your setup process. Well, that page was still accessible even after the system was up and running. So if I knew what that URL was, all I did was go to that URL on that ConnectWise system, and it would tell me, go ahead and create an administrator password. And that would overwrite the existing administrator password. So now I have admin access to that box, but the legitimate owners no longer do, unless I use a poor password and they can guess the password I was using. But I now have admin access and I can get into the back end of all these different networks. Ouch. So, this one was given a score of a perfect 10 for what should be obvious reasons, right? Anybody with a web browser can do this. Shodan can tell you what systems are vulnerable and where. And all you need to know is that, super secret URI, which wasn't all that super secret. So that's why this got a 10. And we tend to see about 40 of these a year. But there's usually some level of mitigating circumstances that keep things from being 10s. I mentioned, if you drop from a 10 down to a 9.8, now we've got about 2,300 on average that kind of show up at that level there. Chris, is not a vulnerability CSVB, it's a feature, Dave. Yeah, that's it. Awesome. So limitations of qualitative, one is it really comes down to how skilled is the person doing it. So this is one of those things that, hey, I'm new to this, right? I just went through some training. I'm going to go in and start doing some risk analysis. I'm kind of green. Because you're green, it's going to be harder for you to be good at this. It really kind of comes down to that. Not as much of an option when you were new. The other part of it too is, okay, so I tell you something is critical that doesn't necessarily identify the potential financial impact to the environment, right? Like I mentioned, hey, MSBs are dropping these boxes on everybody's network, and someone could log in and change the admin password and get access to all the internal systems through a remote console session. What's the financial impact of that? Pretty damn huge, right? But how big is it? Well, qualitative doesn't necessarily pull that in. I need to kind of stop and start looking at the individual pieces and start making guesses about what I think the potential financial impact of all of that could be. But like I said, we tend to use this a lot. So despite all of those um, caveats, this is the number one method we tend to use when we go in and we do risk analysis. The one you want to use if you can, because it will impress your boss, it'll impress the finance group, it'll put you in a more likely position to actually get your projects funded, is quantitative. So what quantitative does is quantitative actually tries to put some numbers down to calculate the potential financial losses that could be associated with certain risks. There's a lot of algorithms here, right? So there's the probability risk assessment. We'll come back and talk about that one a little bit more. But the probabilistic, I can never say that word, risk assessment. Right? That's going to be kind of our final evaluation of, how bad could this be? What could it cost us? And knowing that dollar value is going to help drive what we may be able to spend in order to go in and try and reduce or mitigate this risk. Single loss expectancy. What's that? Single loss expectancy is what's the potential loss due to a single event. And I'll actually get into these a little bit more detail as we go through. So I'll circle back into these in just a bit. Annual rate of occurrence is just how often do we think we might get hit with this? And that annual loss expectancy is actually a calculation that looks at, hey, what's it going to cost me if this happens once? And how often do I think this might happen? Right? So to keep this simple and easy to follow, right? Let's say my single loss expectancy, excuse me, is $10, right? If this risk comes to fruition and we get exploited, it's going to cost us $10, just to keep the numbers easy. If the annual rate of occurrence is we think it's going to happen every year, Well, now we can look at, hey, it's going to cost us $10 a year to deal with this. If we can spend $5 to make this go away, that may be beneficial to us. If we think it's going to happen twice a year, well, now the single loss expectancy is $10. We think it'll happen twice a year. 10 times 2, it's going to cost us $20 a year to deal with this. So now we start looking at, hey, if we could mitigate this for, up to like instead of $5, we could go as high as $12 to mitigate this, and it may make sense. What if the, single loss expectancy is $10, but the annual rate of occurrence is every other year? Well, if it's every other year, then that cuts the $10 in half. It's only $5. So the annual cost of dealing with this particular risk is $5. Now our budget needs to fit within that $5 range in order to be able to actually make sense. You see where I'm going with this? If I look at this and I say, I want to spend $40 to mitigate risk, I've got to be able to clearly make an argument that the risks I will mitigate could cost us much more than that $40. Think of it as so think about like your car insurance, right? If your insurance agent said, we're going to charge you $1,000 a year, but we will never pay more than $1,000 if you get in a car accident, you're going to look at that car insurance very differently, right? What the hell is this getting me? I don't get in a car accident every year. I haven't been in a car accident in 10 years. So they need to be able to potentially protect me from spending, 10 times that at least before I'm even going to consider that car insurance. This is how we end up kind of dealing with budgets as we go through this. Let's see. I saw a question pop through. HK was saying, uh, "What will, what will we be basing ARO? So that's the annual rate of occurrence of previous breach reports. Yes or no?" That's a great question, dude. So the reality is there's some general guesstimates, but that's probably one of the least studied things out there. By that I mean I haven't seen really good studies that go through and kind of talk about, oh, hey, for a web exploit, if you are in the, services, vertical, you may run into it every 5 years. If you're a hospital, you might run into it every 7 years. If you're into, automotive repair, you might see it every 3 years, whatever. I haven't seen a really good study along those lines. The ballpark tends to be people get whacked about every 5 to 8 years. It's maybe the same exploit twice if they're dumb, or it may end up being something different. But 5 to 8 years getting whacked tends to be about the typical cadence for most organizations globally. Great question. Okay, so that's single loss expectancy, right? So we were saying single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence. How often do we think this is going to be occurring? That's going to kind of help us figure out what's the overall cost of dealing with this risk, and that's going to help us kind of figure out budget based on that. But single loss expectancy is actually a combination of two different things, the value of the asset and the exposure factor of the asset. Meaning, excuse me, the exposure factor is the percentage of the percentage of the asset value that we may lose during an event. And this is where things get really funky. This is where this method gets kind of hard, right? Uh, so E times ARO equals L. Yeah. So this is where things get kind of funky, because what if they break in and they steal private data? Well, the asset's still there. We could still use it. The data's still there, but there's reputational stuff that we have to worry about from there, right? What if, excuse me, what if they get in and they're running crypto mining on the asset? Well, now the data's still there. The server's usable. It just runs much slower. Data hasn't been stolen. We're just losing CPU time. What's the dollar value that we could associate with that? See where I'm going with this? Sometimes these calculations get a little bit challenging. So I mentioned that even with quantitative, where we're calculating quantities, there's still going to be some level of qualitative, you know, using a quality person to make their best guesses, because we're still kind of ballparking some of this as we go through, because there aren't, definitive clear numbers we can always fall back on. And data breach example, yeah. So, I kind of mentioned this one really quick. So we're in a situation where someone's broken into one of our systems and they've stolen the personal identifiable information associated with all of our customers. So what's the cost of recovery for something like that? The asset's still there, it's still working, but now we're kind of dealing with reputational information. We got to get legal involved. There may be disclosures we have to go through. We may have to hire a team to run incident response if we don't have the skill sets for that on staff. Even though technically nothing's been broken, right? That thing is still working. Just having data copied off of it could have a whole lot of costs that are associated with that. So that exposure factor, you know, applying it to this specific use case is kind of hard, right? Because the database is still functional. You could also, like, how much is this going to cost us from a PR perspective? Well, hell, everybody gets compromised these days, right? It's not the stigma it used to be. Go back 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and if you got compromised, there was a really strong chance that you could lose an awful lot of business. Today, that's possible, but it's far less likely because we've almost kind of become numb to these, right? I can remember that, like, um, I can remember when Home Depot got compromised. Like 3 days after they got compromised, I needed to go home to Home Depot and buy a lot of stuff. And did I say, well, they got compromised, so I guess I won't buy these things after all? Well, they were the only ones really selling the stuff I needed. So I went in and basically said, okay, which credit card am I going to use? That if it gets popped, it's not going to mess things up on me. I'll use that credit card. It isn't the fallout that it used to be. But if we kind of look at this and we look at, so what could be the cost that's associated with? There are a number of studies out there that actually kind of guesstimate what is this cost for the average organization, and it's about 4.5 million an episode. So every time you get popped and somebody steals some data, expect it to be around $4.5 million to recover from that. Now, you know, small shop, it might be a whole lot less than that. Larger shop, it might be a whole lot larger than that. This is, kind of global average type of thing. We're looking at about 4.5 million. Now, HK was asking about this. How often is this going to occur? And as I mentioned, there really isn't good data in this space. Because I might see Acme Corp got popped and then got popped again 6, 7 years later. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was because of the same risk. It might have been a completely different risk that caused them to get popped the second time. They may not get popped for this same risk until all the people responsible for maintaining those systems leave. They bring in new systems, and the new staff doesn't know to mitigate that type of a risk, and then they get popped again. And that might take 10 years, 15 years, who knows? So if you look at what's out there, you come up with around 6.5 years. And that's a really loose guess for as far as frequency goes. So we could probably lose about $4.5 million every time we get popped. We're probably looking at getting popped every 6.5 years. So that's 0.15 events per year. So if I just go through and do the math, I end up at around $670,000 just to kind of deal with this one type of an issue. So when I start looking at, okay, what do I need to spend to mitigate this? That 670 kind of ends up being my top end of my scale, right? Because if I spend that, well, I'm not gaining anything because I'm going to end up spending that if I get popped. And hey, maybe I'll get lucky and it'll take longer to get popped than it normally does. I might get lucky. People always hope they get lucky, and it very rarely happens. So that might be a possibility here too. Um, not a lot to work with though, right? When you talk about like hiring staff and having software and processes and all this stuff, One of the things I'm big on is security tends to be a cost center. As the senior most security person. So whether you're the, CISO, director of security, security manager, whatever your damn title is within that organization, you're the senior person in security. Your number one goal in life has to be getting you reclassified from being part part of customer acquisition, somewhere in that revenue stream. You want to be revenue enablement as opposed to being a cost center. What's the difference? Well, okay, let me put it this way. So facilities, is responsible for like emptying out the trash cans. How much money does a company really want to spend emptying out the trash cans? They do it because they have to, but it doesn't help them sell more product. So they don't put any more into it than they have to, right? We're getting classified the same way as that. Well, we want to get classified as the same as sales or marketing, right? Because with sales and marketing, they kind of look at it as, hey, give us more money and we can get more, more revenue coming in. We want to be able to rewrite the story to be able to look at it that way. And yeah, I do teach a leadership class. I go through processes from that. But the bottom line is you need to kind of look at what is the purpose of your organization? What is it they are trying to accomplish? How can you align security to better support that? That might be sitting in on sales calls in order to be able to answer any security questions that come up during an initial discovery phase. That might be, coming up with security attestations and getting those put into place so that when a large company says, well, we need to ask you some questions about your security, you get to say, sure, no problem. And hey, just so you know, we've got our SOC 2 or ISO 27001, we've got, HIPAA, we've got, whatever. Here's the full list. And now the customer feels a lot less worried about signing up with us just from a security perspective, which will not only drive more customers, but larger customers with bigger pocketbooks as well. So again, senior security person, your number one job is to stop being a cost center. That's more important for you to do than anything. So security needs to be an enabler, not a blocker. I totally, completely agree with that assessment. Absolutely. We're security. We're here to help. Well, maybe you don't word it quite that way, but you get the idea. More on risk transfer. Well, actually, we kind of beat this one up a lot, but I talked about how, um, yeah, technically you can't outsource that risk, but actually you kind of can. And how much of that you get to offload on a third party, it kind of comes down to where is the assets located, right? Like if I have servers in my data center, but I hire a third party to manage those for me, if those servers get popped, I'm still on the hook because I fully control those assets. But if I move those assets to, let's say, EC2, well, now I might be able to make or have Amazon take over responsibility for these layers, while I only need to worry about these layers up here. Oh, that's a whole lot better. Well, what if I can go to a SaaS service, right? So like credit card processing, I could do it on my own data in my own servers in my own data center. Well, now I'm responsible for everything. Or I could spin up instances in EC2. Well, now Amazon is responsible for these layers and I still take on responsibilities for these layers. Or I sign up for a service like Stripe and now my security kind of comes down to who has access and do they use proper authentication? Right? Like, are we enforcing strong passwords and two-factor? If so, check, we're done. That's all we're really going to be responsible for because everything else is being handled by the organization that we outsourced it to. Now, there are some fuzzy lines, right? Like when you look at when you talk about like let's say PCI, right? If I go into EC2, the delineation of responsibility is kind of right above the hypervisor type of thing. So that would imply that Amazon is responsible for the firewall because the firewall is a network device. But what you'll find is that if you try to achieve your PCI attestation within EC2, Amazon will provide you with a firewall, but you're responsible for managing that firewall. So you end up in a situation where, like I said, there's a fuzzy line. It's kind of split duties at that point. Is that not a real hybrid model, transfer, mitigate, accept? Yeah, absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. Impact on it. Yeah. So, is this technically a get out of jail free card? Yeah, you could kind of argue that either way, which we already have. If you want more on this topic, I do have a class around this. There are a lot of really good resources out there. I would recommend, if like leadership is something you're actually interested in, I would highly recommend starting your journey by reading Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek. That is an awesome book. And next week, next week on Fireside Fridays. So wait, so should we go to like a 2-minute commercial and then come back with previews for next week? Yeah, that's it. No, well, actually, I guess we technically did that, right? So I was like, oh, hey, I got a leadership class. Ha ha ha. Yeah. So next week we're going to go back to doing hands-on stuff. We're going to go back to kind of working with the stack, and we're going to talk about layer two communications. So we're going to talk specifically about how do systems, when they're on the same logical network segment with each other, how do they exchange data back and forth type of thing? That's what we're going to be talking about next week. Well, like as I said, there'll be some hands-on labs you can do. If you have a window access to a Windows and or a Linux system, you will have everything you need to do the hands-on stuff next week. And with that said, we are done. So I want to say thank you to everybody for turning out this week. I appreciate it. Um, we get a lot of love because we're hosting this, and my name gets tacked on this or whatever. But I really do want to give a good shout out to like HK and Eric and all the others that show up all the time, every pretty much every time, every week, and have been doing it for bloody years and jumping in and helping out other folks that have questions. Um, it puts a smile on my face. How often I see somebody has a question and I say, "Oh, that's a good question. I'll have to answer that. Let me just finish this train of thought." And before I can answer it, two or three other people have already jumped in and helped out. So yeah, I just like want to send a little love the way of the folks that are here helping out all the time with this stuff. So with that said, thank you everybody.